fun with a group, right? But also, Christmas Eve is past. Well, welcome. We're continuing, starting in January now, and we'll continue up until I leave in the early parts of the spring for Turkey. But we'll continue with our series. Our series this time is going to be more focused about the mother church, we could call it. And that is the church at Antioch, from which Paul and Barnabas and John Mark began the first missionary journey. We shared a little bit about Antioch, showed some photos about Antioch, described the city itself, one of the 5 largest cities in all of the Mediterranean, estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 250, perhaps as many as 300,000 people back in the first century. And the population's about that, actually a little bit more than that today. Well, actually, I can't say today, but because of the earthquakes that have taken place, the city has been divested of most of its population, though hopes are that with the rebuilding, much of that population will return. But I want to pick up, so if you've got a Bible, you can follow along with me. Acts chapter 13, and we'll take the first 4 verses just to begin. There were at Antioch, in the church that was there, prophets and teachers, Barnabas and Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And while they were ministering to the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." Then, when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, they sent them away. So being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. Now, just some comments with regard to the text here. You're familiar with Barnabas. Barnabas is mentioned earlier in the Acts of the Apostles. He becomes Paul's faithful traveling companion on this first mission. There's also a fellow named Simeon. He's described and numbered among the prophets and teachers. Simeon is also called Niger. That's a Latin loan word in Greek. Literally it means black. So he is probably a black individual, Christian. He's got the name Simeon, which is a Jewish name, so we would assume that he's black. We then have, one more comment with regard to Lucius of Cyrene. He also may have been one of the persons who was dispersed. We've talked before about in Acts chapter 8 with the persecution that Paul initiated in Jerusalem. As a consequence of that, many of the Christians were dispersed out of Jerusalem, out of Judea. Many of them fled north to Phoenicia, and many of them came to Antioch. And it's mentioned specifically that some of these people who were dispersed at that time came from Cyrene. So it's kind of easy to connect and say that Lucius may be one of those persons who made their way to Antioch from Jerusalem. And so then we have Saul also. So those are the 5 that are praying and fasting. Fasting is something that we don't often do as Christians, but it's something that we do, of course, when we're entreating the Lord. And it's a good practice to be involved in fasting because I think we hear with much more clarity when we fast and pray. And that's what's happening. What is also interesting to note here in verse 2 is it specifically stated that the Holy Spirit spoke in their presence. Okay, it's not like, this committee got together, they're scratching their heads and, hey, I think this would be a good idea, let's go out on a mission. Specifically, it says, the Holy Spirit spoke and said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." And so they continued to fast and pray, laid hands on them, sent them away. And then it's reiterated in verse 4. Then being sent out, not by the church, then being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and there they sailed to Cyprus. So let's get a map up here. Okay, this is the region that we're talking about. You can see over on the upper right hand of the screen, you can see Antioch. This is called Syrian Antioch. There were as many as 13 cities around the Mediterranean that were named Antioch. Antioch was named after Antiochus, who was a Seleucid ruler, one of the generals of Alexander the Great. And once Alexander passed away, the massive empire of Alexander was carved up by the Diadochoi, who then took different portions. In the area of Syria was assumed by a guy named Antiochus, and that's where these cities came to acquire their names. So they had to be designated also by the region or the district in which they were located, and since Antioch is in the region of Syria, this is often referred to as Syrian Antioch. And this is where Paul began all three of his missions that are recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, Antioch is not a coastal city. It's actually on the Orontes River. Several weeks ago, when we talked about Antioch, we showed you pictures of the Orontes River. And the Orontes River empties into the Mediterranean at a location called They Had Taken. They hopped on a ship. Ships, of course, back in the past were much different than ships are today. They are not very seaworthy. As a matter of fact, there's a great deal of fear with regard to sea travel. But the only ships that really were taking people from one destination to another were merchant ships. There were no passenger ships like today, like what are some of the cruise ships that you see advertised on football games, things of that. None of that really existed. They're commercial ships, merchant ships, and what typically would happen is if you wanted to travel via the seas, you go down to the port, down to the harbor, you connect with the captains and ask the captains where they're going. And you're going where the cargo goes, okay? And so this is a ship that was discovered in the waters offshore of Kyrenia, which is the northern part of Cyprus. This is a 4th century BC merchant ship. There were 500 amphoras that were discovered on this ship. Amphoras were filled with wine, were filled with oils. Okay, amphoras are bottles with a pointed neck to them. And this sank somewhere near the beginning of the 3rd century BC. And so this would probably be a ship similar to what Paul would have hopped on, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark would have hopped on as they made their way to the island of Cyprus. Once they landed, they came here. This is the ancient harbor of Salamis. Salamis is on the eastern side of the island, a water basin where the sailors, the fishermen, would empty their catch into this basin. So they moor the ship, they empty their catch, they put their baskets and everything else back on the ship, and then from here they go and sell their product. So just a little bit about the harbor at Salamis. I want to continue then with verse 5. When they reached Salamis, they began to proclaim the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. They also had John as their helper. Now this John is John Mark, okay, who was probably the author of the 2nd gospel. We read about him elsewhere in the scriptures. John Mark accompanied Barnabas on the 2nd mission. 2nd mission, of course, is when Paul and Barnabas split up and went their separate ways. He's also mentioned in the letter of 1 Peter. So we see a little bit about Mark here and there. But we never read about him anywhere in the Gospels. Even though he wrote the 2nd gospel, he didn't write the 2nd gospel from eyewitness testimony. He actually wrote it from the recollections of Peter. That's what Justin Martyr tells us. Also want to note that, and this is a pattern that we will discover throughout our studies of Paul and his travels, is Paul always goes first to the synagogue. He doesn't go to the agora, that is the marketplace where most of the people would assemble. He always goes to the synagogue. And this is part of Paul's policy because he believes, and I should say believed to his dying day, that the Jewish people were raised up as a priestly nation whose mission it was not to keep the truth to themselves, but to share the gospel message, God's message, to the rest of the world. Now, unfortunately, that didn't often happen among Jewish communities. That's why Paul is trying to awaken Jewish communities to their responsibility to do as God had called them to do. As a matter of fact, even in Peter's letter, 1 Peter, he talks about the Jewish nation as a priestly nation, okay, whose task it was to share the gospel. So they come to Salamis. The first place they go is to the synagogues. Now, actually, let me retract that statement a little bit. Probably the first place that they go is to the public baths. Reason being, they're taking on these ways, enter into the public baths. And then once we get inside, we have the bathing areas. And this is, of course, a waiting pool. And you see statues out and around the periphery of the waiting pool. Many people would spend a lot of time loitering around in the baths. As a matter of fact, business could be conducted in the baths. It's the place where many people would socialize. Of course, the primary place where people would socialize would be the agora, but others would socialize and hang out at the baths. This is an interesting piece here and really fairly rare. This is a basalt statue of a woman. Okay, most, of course, are limestone. Some of them might be marble, but this is basalt. Basalt is a volcanic black rock. And you'll also notice that there's no head. And the reason for that is that the head could be replaced. So, of course, you have governors, and governors, of course, many times would be depicted in the statues around a city, and you'd also have relatives, perhaps the wife of the governor, or it may be a civic official. And so when you have a new governor and a new civic official or wife, you can put in a new head. Okay, so that's a common feature that you see with many statues. Statues, of course, tremendous amount of artwork, and of course the people who create these things, it's amazing to me. This is a small bath called a frigidarium. This is where the cold water would be. When you first enter into a bath house, you would go to the frigidarium, then you would make your way over to the tepidarium, which is warm water, and make your way to the caldarium, which would be the hot water. And then as you would exit the baths, you would sequentially go in reverse from the caldarium to the tepidarium to the frigidarium, and then you would exit, go to the apoditarium, where you would put on your clothes, towel off, and make your way back into the city. So that's part of the process. We're going to see more of the baths and some of the others that we'll see along the way. This again is at Salamis. This is one of the colonnaded streets, a Roman street, dates back to the time of Paul. Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark very well may have walked on this street, as well as walking on this street, another Roman street that's been excavated at Salamis. There's a lot of good work that's been done at Salamis, but still there's a lot. The city was quite large, and there's still a lot that can be discovered in the excavations in the years to come, hopefully. Here again, we have another fresco on a building. Just zooming in a little bit here, you can see. It's really quite amazing that these things can survive for 2,000 years, and in some cases 2,200 years. You notice the figure, you can just see the legs in the lower part of the torso, the figure over on the left-hand side. It's got some wings on it, so a good chance that this is probably Mercury, or also known as Hermes. Hermes, or Mercury, was known as the messenger god by the Greeks and the Romans. Here's a nice Roman street. It's got a berm. Got to tell you, the Romans knew how to build streets, and very durable streets, many of which survive unto today. I think in the past I've also shown you some Roman bridges that even today can sustain vehicular traffic. And that's, to me, pretty amazing stuff. And then just outside of the baths, you have this structure. This is called the palaestra. The palaestra is an exercise facility. It looks like an agora, but actually it doesn't have the purpose of an agora. An agora is a marketplace. It's where people do commercial activity, the buying and selling of goods and commodities, things of that sort. The palaestra is an exercise facility. So these are places where, well, people would throw the discus, people would wrestle, like Penn State just beat Michigan State 55-0 on Friday. I hope we don't have any Michigan State fans here to embarrass. But at any rate, this is where exercise would take place. You can see it's colonnaded out and around the periphery. Another shot of it down here, but you can see on the right-hand side one of the streets that's lining the palaestra, and there would have been shops also in the interior of that. Moving on, we go to a theater at Salamis. Any city of any size whatsoever, practically any city is going to have a theater, so we're going to see several theaters in some of the other cities that we visit. This theater has been partially restored. I think you can see the older pieces that are in front, closest to the camera, but then you can see other places where the seating has been damaged or just was not in good enough shape, and as a consequence has been replaced. But that's a theater at Salamis. We then make our way to the necropolis. The necropolis is a cemetery. This is where people are buried. And so we've got different necropoli here. You've got tombs for the peasants, very poor people. Of course, they're not very elaborate. Then we also have tombs for the nobility. And these are very nice tombs. And this is one of those tombs for the nobles. And so if you climb inside of that hole there, this is what you see on the inside. This is quite a large tomb. It was a family tomb, so it's not like an individual would be buried here, but a family would be buried. And then one of the important tombs at Salamis is the tomb of Barnabas. Okay, and a church was built over what, according to tradition, was where Barnabas was entombed, was buried. So if you go downstairs, underground, you will come to this tomb, which is, according to tradition, the tomb of Barnabas. It's possible that Barnabas is buried here. But again, some of these traditions are not really well attested, and it's possible that these are the remains of Barnabas, but it's possible also that it may not. Okay. Barnabas, of course, we'll read about this a little bit later when we get to chapter 15. In chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas split up, take their separate ways. Barnabas joins up with John Mark, and they head back to Cyprus, and that's the last we hear about Barnabas. According to tradition, Barnabas spent the rest of his life, or at least the bulk of the rest of his life, on the island of Cyprus. And not surprising, Barnabas was a native Cypriot. He was, interesting fact, related to John Mark. They were cousins, and they were both Cypriots. And so at this point in time, when the mission begins, remember, Barnabas was the one who was sent up to the church at Syrian Antioch. He was the leader of the church. He called Paul to help him, okay? And so as they depart on this mission, Barnabas is the leader. So Barnabas in the text is always mentioned first. But halfway through the mission, that kind of flip-flops. Paul becomes the dominant speaker. As a consequence, he becomes the leader of the mission. So it's not surprising, as the leader of the mission, that Barnabas wants to go to his home. That is, to his kinfolk, to other Cypriots, and share the good news of the gospel. So he and John Mark are with Paul on this journey, and they make their way to the island. Okay, continuing on, Acts chapter 13, verse 6. When they had traveled or had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, we'll pause at that point. They go through the whole island as far as Paphos. Okay? So it states here that the three of them traveled the length of the island of Cyprus. Now the question is, what route did they take? This is a map that shows you not only the terrain of Cyprus, but also some of the known Roman routes. Now, you have to help me with the lines here. I think the red, I'm guessing that the red, solid red lines indicate known Roman roads on the island of Cyprus. The ones that are dotted are ones that are thought to be, or portions of those roads have been discovered. So if you look over on to the, maybe it's too hard to see with the print, Salamis, over on the far right-hand side in the middle of the screen. You see that, Salamis? Okay, that's where they started. Now, as far as the topography is concerned, we have two mountain ranges which define the island of Cyprus. The northern mountain range is that long northern stretch that stretches out to the finger that goes all the way up to the northeast. Okay, that's a mountain range that defines the northern part of Cyprus. And then you also see south of that, into the fat part of Cyprus, you see another range, and then you see the valley in between them. Okay, so the slopes of the two mountain ranges with the valley in between them, that's basically Cyprus. Now, how did they go? Okay, now they probably didn't go along the north because of this mountain range. I've been up in the north, and it's beautiful climbing up onto those mountains. You can see the range, and I'm looking directly west along that mountain range. I'm on one of the mountains and looking directly west, and you can see then off onto the right-hand side, that's the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? Of course, there were monasteries that were built there. This is Hilarion Castle. It's on the top of one of those mountains. You can see that it's well fortified with walls out and around it and all the monastic structures that are within the interior. If you go all the way to the furthest part of the northeast, you come to Carpassia. I drove the entire length out there. That's a long, long road on a dirt road to get out to the very tip. And you see this, which is another one of the, it's a church. It's not a monastery, a church that is at the furthest extent. And then you can see the sea off into the distance also, where this church is just on the shoreline. That's not the route that Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark would have taken. Instead, they took the southern route, probably because it's a more efficient way of getting from one side to the other. And we also know that there are Roman roads connecting the route that you see that I've traced out. Now, there's nothing mentioned about the cities along the way, so we're going to take a peek at Kition, going to look at Amathus and Kurion, because I strongly suspect Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark spent time there. Okay, the whole route from the east to the west would have been 140 miles, and actually the way they walked it, probably even more than 140 miles, which means they took, if they're on a fast trot, okay, moving quickly, taking time for food and everything, 14 days. I suspect it was probably longer than 14 days to cross the island because, of course, their purpose of being on the island is to share the good news of the gospel. So they're going to want to go to these towns and villages and to spend some time with the people and share the good news of Jesus with those folks. So we're talking about a long journey along the coast of Cyprus. First place that they come to is this place, Kition. Not much remains of Kition. It's the modern city of Larnaca. Originally, the city was founded as far back we know as about 1400, 1300 BC, okay, but was then destroyed also by the sea people. The sea people were marauders who came from the sea. We don't know exactly where they came from, and actually destroyed many of the civilizations that were coastal civilizations, all the way down to Egypt for that matter. So the city then, once the sea people passed on, later on in time, Cretans, people from the island of Crete, reestablished, probably merchants from Crete, reestablished settlements at this location at Kition. What you're looking at here is the temple of Aphrodite. Aphrodite was the main goddess of the island of Cyprus. Now, if we go all the way back to Homer, you folks remember Homer, right? Okay. He refers to Aphrodite as Kypris, which is Cyprus. Okay. She was known as the Cypriot, the goddess that came from Cyprus. Okay. According to the myth, Aphrodite was born from the sea at Cyprus. And so you can see many temples and sanctuaries dedicated to her. So this is, like I say, that's Kition. That's another shot, a closer shot of the temple. All that remains of it, not much, You can see the modern city of Larnaca off onto the distance. We do have at Katian an aqueduct. Now, the aqueduct has been rebuilt many times, and most recently it's been rebuilt, but you can see that it's been rebuilt upon the remains of the ancient aqueduct. So it's kind of composite, a little bit of the past mixed in with the future. Moving along, we go to Kairakatia. This is probably the earliest settlement, at least the earliest settlement that we know about on the island of Cyprus. This dates to 7,000 BC up until around 5,800 BC. These are some of the earliest people who existed there. We know that they were engaged in some primitive agriculture, animal husbandry, and hunting. That's probably how they came to exist. And so these are some of the remains that date back all that time. And this is one of the dwellings of at Kairakatia. I didn't go in that any further than what I took the picture. Doing like snakes. Moving along the coast, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark made their way to Amathus. This is the modern city of Limassol. You can see here again some of the harbor structures. The harbor structures take a beating because they've got the waves coming in, crashing in constantly, and so what meager remains of the harbor can be seen. You're lucky to see as much as you can. This is a fountain, an elaborate fountain, really, at Amathus. This is the Agora. A synagogue has not been discovered at Amathus. We don't know if there was actually a Jewish community at Amathus. It's possible that there was. But Paul didn't isolate himself to synagogues. It's not like if Paul comes to a city, oh, no synagogue, well, forget about you folks. He would, of course, still share the good news of the gospel. But Luke, when he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, didn't tell us anything about ministry at Amathus or at Kation or any of these places. Instead, he puts two dots on the map, Salamis and Paphos, okay, the two ends, okay. So at any rate, Paul, in all likelihood, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark spent some time here. And right here in the center of the Agora is an altar to which God, we don't know, perhaps a Roman god, again, not known. The water system is really quite amazing. Here you can see this pipe that goes down the center of the fountain that we had seen a little bit earlier and takes this water into the remaining parts of the city. You can see it's huge and well constructed. Another fountain. Move through these. I've got a lot of photographs, so I'm going to have to move a little more quickly. This is a street leading up to the Acropolis. Many of these cities, ancient cities, often had an Acropolis. An Acropolis was a place, not necropolis, Acropolis. Acropolis means a high city, and necropolis means the city of the dead. Polis, city. Necro means city of dead. Acro means high or high city. So many cities had the Acropolis, and this is where they would flee if their city was attacked. They would have their most important temples up on top of the Acropolis. And that way, if they were attacked, they would plead with their deity to save them, to rescue them. And often they would have their palace for their king up on the Acropolis as well. Of course, during the Roman period, the Romans guaranteed Pax Romana, peace. So you didn't have to have a king up on the Acropolis back in those days. But as you make the ascent to the Acropolis, here's another shot of the Agora. Another shot of the Agora. This is interesting here. This is a bath. This is a Greek bath. The Greeks had different baths than the Romans did. But as time progressed and the Romans took over the Mediterranean, the Greeks adopted Roman baths. And so this one here, you can see, just zooming in here, you have actually basically small little basins where the bather would sit in this, which is much different than the Roman bath. Roman bath is more like a swimming pool almost, okay? You have benches out and around the periphery where people will sit. Here you have individual water basins for baths. So this is quite interesting because you see the more ancient Greek baths here at Mothus. We finally get up onto the Acropolis, the top of the city, and you can see archaeological excavations that are still being conducted by the Greeks. Now, I failed to mention, maybe it's good at this point to mention, that the island of Cyprus today is divided. The northern part is primarily Turkish, although there is some Greeks who still live in the northern part of Cyprus. Southern part is primarily Greek. And of course, there's been a lot of animosity. I don't know how much of you, or how many of you are familiar with the struggle of what has been going on at Cyprus over the past 60, 70, even 80 years. But a lot of hostilities, so as a consequence, the island today is divided. If you want to know more about that, take a peek at the web, and they'll explain a lot of the details of what this struggle is all about. And also up on the Acropolis, of course, you have two large limestone vases. The one over on to the left is damaged, as you can see, and these date to the 6th and 5th centuries BC. So we're talking about large vases, and I'm talking about large because they're 6 feet 1 inch in height, you know how high they are, weighing 14 tons. These are massive urns, vases, vessels at the top with handles, 4 handles decorated. Let me show you a close-up here, decorated with a bowl on the 4 sides. These probably had wine in them, and the wine was probably used in the worship services for the goddess Aphrodite. And this, of course, is what remains of the temple of Aphrodite. Again, not much. And from here, of course, you can see off into the distance the blue sea of the Mediterranean. Moving right along, okay? Paul, Barnabas and company, made their way to Kurion. Kurion, of course, is a coastal city. It's one of the large cities. Incidentally, these are the big cities, the cities where there are remains that exist even to today, things that you can see. No doubt, along the coast, there were smaller villages also. And unfortunately, the smaller villages have been wiped out with modern development or with, just the degradation that takes place over the course of time. But we finally make our way then over to Kurion, and here we approach the necropolis. The necropolis, again, is a place where people are buried. The necropolis is always outside of the city, okay, because the dead bodies would have a stench and also the impurities associated with a dead and rotting corpse. So the ancient cities, never do you see a necropolis within the city. It's always on the periphery, on the outside of the city. Today, it's different. We bury people within the city. But again, you can see some of the tombs of people who existed there in the past. One of the dwellings there, one of the best preserved dwellings, is the house of Eustolios. This man was a Christian, okay? This was originally constructed in the early Roman period and was remodeled in the early Byzantine period, probably remodeled between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And what you see here is a mosaic floor. I actually turned it upside down so you can see it, right side up. You can probably tell from the angle of the photograph that, I'm from one side of it. But we also have the Greek word here, ktisis, okay? That means creation. And of course, what you also have is a woman. This is an anthropomorphism, a depiction of creation. And she's holding a measuring rod, which is kind of interesting because the scriptures sometimes, like in the book of Revelation, a measuring rod is given to one of the angels to measure, okay? And so this depicts creation, okay? This is the look from the house of Eustolios. As you can see out into the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see, you can see that the city is a little bit distant from, maybe 500 meters from the coast, and it's elevated also, okay? You'll see more of this in the photographs that follow after that. In the house of Eustolius, we have this inscription, and the inscription reads, "This house, in place of its ancient armaments of walls and iron and bronze and steel, now has encompassed itself with the much venerated symbols of Christ." We don't need protection. Christ protects this house. So if you look at the third line, the bottom line, and go all the way over to the right-hand side, you can see the last 7 letters, Christu. Symbols of Christ, Christu. So again, this is how we know that Eustolius was a Christian. So quite interesting that we found an early Christian home, as the excavators have not only excavated the home, but also they've done a wonderful job. They've preserved it. They've got a roof over the top of it to protect it from weather, rain, things of that sort. And so it's in good shape. You've got the obligatory theater at Kourion. This one has been restored in a much more ambitious way. I like to see things as they were. And sometimes the restoration projects look too modern. Even though it's the place, even though it's there are pieces that still extend back to the ancient period. Still, I think they've overdone it here. I'd like to see more of the ancient theater rather than this. Another shot of the theater, you can see off again over onto the right, the upper right-hand corner, more of the Mediterranean. Kition experienced earthquakes. We're talking about the Mediterranean world, right? And this is a house that shows construction after the earthquake, but also evidence of the fact that portions of the house were never really put back together after the earthquake had taken place. This is the primary church that was discovered at Kourion. This is called the Episcopal Basilica. This dates to the early 5th century AD. And then you can see off into the distance, once again, you can see the shelf upon which the city of Kourion sits. It's an elevated position. And if you go really, you drop off the far end of the basilica here, you've got a cliff that goes down to a small beach area until you get into the sea. But again, this is a church dating from the 5th century. Baths, of course, you have baths here. Earlier I showed you a picture of the frigidarium. These 2 sections are the tepidarium and the caldarium. Okay, now the shot that I've taken here goes right down the center. There was a wall that was built up that separated the caldarium and the tepidarium on the left-hand side, the right-hand side. And you'll also notice that the little knobs that you see on the floor there are pedestals. And those pedestals would have been up higher and would have supported a floor. So if you go all the way, I'm going to go in close here. You can see there, they've restored some of the pedestals there and have put together part of the floor of the caldarium there to show you what it was like back in the day. Then one other shot from Kourion is what is called the House of the Gladiators. We don't know the function of the House of the Gladiators. It may have been a place for the training of gladiators. Gladiator contests were very popular venues and parts of entertainment. And you see here the Margaretes. And the Margaretes is, it means pearl or pearl gatherer. It's where we get the word Margaret, okay? And he's pitted against the Hellenikos, or the Hellenist, or the Greek, okay? So probably what we would call the Greek against the barbarian in this gladiator contest. There are several other mosaics of gladiators in this house, and that's one of the reasons why it's suspected that this may be a house that was owned by a gladiator, perhaps a former gladiator who retired, or perhaps a place where gladiators were trained. Okay, let's get back to the text of Acts. We've got a long passage here, a long section. When they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, they found a magician, a Jewish false prophet, whose name was Bar-Jesus, who was with the proconsul, Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence. This man, talking about Sergius Paulus, summoned Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas, the magician, for so his name is translated, was opposing them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who is also known as Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, fixed his gaze on him and said, "You who are full of all deceit and fraud, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, will you not cease to make crooked the straight ways of the Lord? Now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you will be blind, and you will not see the sun for a time." And immediately a mist and a darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking those who would lead him by the hand. We recollect that, the person who's uttering those words is the same person who experienced the same blindness on the road to Damascus. That's a theme. We'll talk about this in just a little bit, of course, but it's a theme that we see in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles. But let's first take a peek at Paphos. Paphos, of course, is the far western coastal city. You can see the Mediterranean off into the distance. And, of course, it's a very wealthy city. Many of the nobility settled in Paphos, so it's rich. And as a consequence, you see in the remains many homes of people who are very rich, quite wealthy. And as a consequence, you see mosaic floors. This is, you can see a couple of mosaic floors, one over onto the left and also the one over onto the right-hand side. These are very expensive, okay? These, even today would be tremendously expensive to put into your home. I'd love to do it, but, And so this is the one that's on the right that I showed you just a little bit earlier. And what's interesting here is you can see up in the upper right-hand corner, Crete. Crete, of course, is Crete, the island of Crete. Crete, of course, is the largest island in the Mediterranean. Cyprus is the second largest. And, of course, one of the myths that's associated with Crete, of course, is the story of Thusis in his fight with the Minotaur in the labyrinth, you may recall. Okay? And so you see, this is what you see depicted here. You see Ariadne up in the upper left-hand corner. You can see the labyrinth. You can see the Minotaur that's being, of course, it's not, the interior of this is not well preserved enough that you can see the Minotaur. I'd like to see the Minotaur a little bit better. And then that's the labyrinth right there. Okay? So this is, like I say, one of the beautiful mosaics. And there are lots, dozens and dozens of these mosaics that you can see in dwellings all over the place. Just one more, I can bore you with these things, I hope, not too much. But this, of course, is a depiction of the birth of Achilles. You're all familiar with Achilles, right? Okay. His mother, Thetis, is reclining on the couch. You can actually see just the first three letters of the name Achilles near her knee, over a little bit further to the right. And then you can also see his father, Pelos. And then ominously, you see the three fates, the three women standing off onto the right-hand side. You see Clotho, she's the one who spins the thread. And then you look all the way over to Atropos. Okay? She's the one who measures and then cuts the thread, terminating life. That's fate. Of course, fate was deeply, deeply embedded in Greek culture, Roman culture, most ancient cultures, even Jewish cultures. We've talked about that in some of our other classes. So again, just a little bit of what you can see in some of the dwellings that have been excavated at Paphos. Now let's go back to this magician, this guy who is named Elymas, also known as Bar-Jesus. The name Bar-Jesus, of course, is Jewish, means son of Jesus. Jesus is not, the Jesus that you and I are talking about in the Gospels, of course, is not the only person named Jesus. It's actually a fairly common name within Judaism during the first century. And so this guy is named Bar-Jesus, son of someone else who is named Jesus. But he also had a Greek name, Elymas, okay? And magic was deeply, deeply entrenched in ancient civilizations. Greek civilizations, Roman civilization. If we go to Egypt, you can see magic. Mesopotamia, all over the place, magic was deeply, deeply entrenched. People believed in magic, and Jews as well. And so this is a Jewish bowl that you can see with an incantation, a magic incantation, and it looks like a bird on the inside. We will encounter magicians elsewhere in the Acts of the Apostles. So if we were to go backwards, actually, to Acts chapter 8, remember when Philip came to Samaria, shared the gospel, performed miracles, and he met up with a person there named Simon Magus, right? Magus means magician, Simon the magician. And he was deceiving the people of Samaria with his magic arts, okay? And so what happened commonly among these magicians, that they would deceive people into thinking that they had supernatural powers. They were called divine men, okay? And as a consequence, they could extract money and power from the people because you fear these people, okay, these so-called magicians. Here's another magic bowl. You can see that this is in Aramaic, that is the Jewish language spoken during the first century. This is actually at the Oriental Institute Museum in Chicago. So I don't know if any of you have driven up to University of Chicago, but they've got a terrific museum there with many artifacts, biblical artifacts as well. If you're interested, sometime maybe we take a group up there. It's a lot of fun. Okay, but again, this is a magic bowl with an incantation. And the incantation is a spell for protection against demons and afflictions, diseases. If we go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, we have another Jewish incantation bowl for magic. This is again Aramaic. And, well, this is what we see commonly. If we go to Athens, to the Acropolis Museum at Athens, we have this magic sphere with Helios, that is the sun god depicted on the front, with a lion and a dragon. And this was thought to bring victory in contests. So you cast a spell upon your opponent and you win. Unfortunately, the Steelers didn't have this with them last night. I knew they weren't going to win anyways. What we also have are lead curse tablets that have been discovered, many of these. This is on the island of Kos. What would typically happen is that there would be a spell that would be cast against somebody that you do not like. It would be etched onto lead. It would be rolled up, pierced with a nail, and commonly thrown into a temple of, who's the god? I think of Hermes, but it's not Hermes. It's the god who is the chthonic deity that takes the dead to the underworld. What? No. No. Hades. Okay. No, actually, not Hades. Hades is the god of the underworld, but the one who actually would take. It'll come to me a little bit. At any rate, what you can see here, again, I want to get in a little bit closer so you can see, but you can see here a depiction here of the Egyptian demon god Seth. Okay, you can see he's got human feet, human torso. This is actually, he's kind of lying on his side. Can you see that? With a bird head. Okay, and he's pulling the hair, if you look down to the bottom, of this poor human being. And what's interesting here is it has the name on the flip side, on the other side, 32 lines of writing evoking the magical names of Egyptian deities and also the Jewish Hebrew god Sabaoth, or better known as Yahweh of the Sabbath. And this is asking for the death of a person named Hermias. As a matter of fact, that's who I'm talking about, is Hermes. That's the god of the underworld that transports people, the chthonic deity that transports people to the dead. So this again is a lead tablet, curse tablet. Another one of these is found in the museum at Thessalonica. Okay, again, a lead curse tablet. So this is the guy who then is opposing Paul as he shares the gospel with Sergius Paulus. And of course, what we find is that people who claim to have supernatural powers, people who claim to know God, but are misleading people, this is what we commonly see, is that blindness would take place with those individuals. This occurred to Paul himself and occurs to Elymas as well. Now, the earliest church on the island of Cyprus is this church called the Panaia Chrysopolista. That is a church also known as the Church of St. Paul. And this pillar here is supposedly, according to tradition, a pillar at which Paul was whipped at Paphos. Now, it's a pretty weak tradition, okay? We have no idea at all that Paul was ever mistreated or whipped or beaten on the island of Patmos. It's possible, of course, because when Paul writes to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about many beatings and whippings and things of that sort, and we don't know where most of those took place. So it's possible, but according to tradition, this is a pillar at which Paul was chained and then beaten, okay? Right next to that pillar, we have this church that was dated to the 4th century AD, which indeed is a very early church, was then renovated in the 6th century and then destroyed with the Arab invasion in the 7th century. We have a nice theater. This is the Paphos Theater, and what I like about the Paphos Theater is it's not been restored, so you can see the actual remains, okay, at the Paphos Theater. And then we continue on to the necropolis. We have a massive, large necropolis at Paphos, and so this is where you can come into some of the underground portions of the Paphos necropolis. Again, you have tombs of peasants. This is not one of them. You can see how elaborate and how much work has gone into the tomb of this is again a family tomb, and another one as well. So you can see that these are wealthy people, okay? Part of the nobility, political and commercial people who are very well-to-do. So then let's finish up our section in Acts with 2 more verses. Then the proconsul, that is Sergius Paulus, believed when he saw what had happened, being amazed at the teaching of the Lord. So Elymas is blinded. This is a miracle. He believes the message of Barnabas and Paul, and he becomes Christian. Now this is very important because this is a proconsul. This is the governor of the whole island, okay? And one would think that as a consequence of this, Paul and Barnabas would have an opportunity to do deep ministry throughout the island of Cyprus. So why don't they stay? But they don't, okay? Verse 13 tells us that now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos, and they came to Perga and Pamphylia, but John left them and returned to Jerusalem. So the question is, why did they go to Perga? They're going up to the Turkish what is today Turkish, Anatolian mainland, and they come to the city of Perga. Why? Well, they had lots of opportunity for ministry now opened up with permission from the proconsul. Why did they depart? And the other question is then, why did John Mark depart and go back to Jerusalem? You'll have to wait till next week to find the answer to those questions. But I will give you a clue, okay? This inscription, you can see it's in Latin, okay, was found at another city called Antioch. This is an Antioch in the interior, in the region of Galatia. Remember, Paul wrote a letter to the Galatians. And so this is called Pisidian Antioch, okay? And it is the family of Sergius Paulus. You see, Sergius Paulus was not a native Cypriot. Instead, he was a friend of the emperor at that time, Emperor Claudius. Okay? And Claudius, many times, would appoint his friends, we call them clients, okay, to important positions, governing positions throughout the provinces of Rome, throughout the Mediterranean. And so that's how Sergius Paulus made his way from Galatia, from Pisidian Antioch, to Paphos, the capital city, and was functioning as proconsul. So Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark hop on a ship, and they make the route to the mainland. So let's go back to the map here. Let me zoom into the area that we're more concerned with. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, travel on the seas was not by commercial liner or anything of that sort. You had to go where the cargo was going. So you go down to the port, you talk with the captains of the ships, and where are they taking their cargoes? And what you typically would do, well, you'll go where the cargo is going to go. Or you find another captain to find another ship if there's a ship that's going more in the direction in which you wish to go. So the nearby ports, okay, I point them out here. I have arrows drawn from Paphos. The nearest port would be to Anamurium, over on the right-hand side. I doubt that Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark went to Anamurium, okay, because the next stop in Perga is some distance from Anamurium. Now, another possibility would be Coricasion, okay, which is the next one as we're going to the left. They've got a good port at Coricasion. But again, that seems to be a little more distant. Moving further to the west, we have the city of Side. Side is a very popular holiday spot today for Turkish people and for internationals who come to Turkey. It's a very interesting place. Actually, it was a hideout for pirates. Pirates had seized Side. We know that Side was one of their central places of control. And that's a possibility, because that's a little bit closer to Perga. And then there's another place called Megiddos, as we go over to the left-hand side of the slide. And then the last of the 5 choices is Atalia, which is today the modern city of Antalya, a city of 1 million people. Okay? So where did he go? Again, we'll talk about that next week. But I want to leave you then with what Paul tells us in his letter to the Romans. And I've shared this in another class, so those of you who are in the other class with me have heard this before. But what's involved here is a change in plans, okay? Paul tells us when writing to the Romans, in Romans chapter 1, verse 13, he says, I do not want you to be unaware. He's writing to the Romans, remember. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I have often planned to come to you and have been prevented thus far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. And then, near the end of this letter to the Romans, he has a similar statement. I have often been prevented from coming to you, but now with no further place for me in these regions, and since I've had for many years a longing to come to you, whenever I go to Spain, I hope to see you in passing and to be helped on my way there by you, when I have first enjoyed your company for a while. But now I'm going to Jerusalem serving the saints. Paul wrote this letter to the Romans in the city of Corinth in the year 58 AD. This is at the end of his 3rd missionary journey. We'll get there a little bit later on, be a couple of months from now, okay? But before he departed for Jerusalem, because he's heading back home, okay? He wrote this letter to the Romans saying, I hope to finally see you. And twice, chapter 1, chapter 15, twice he uses this word often. I've often planned to come to you. How many times is often? Well, it's more than twice. It's at least 3 times, right? And so this, I think, was one of those times. And I'll point out in the days to come some of the other times when Paul's plans change. Why? Because it's the Holy Spirit that's leading and guiding Paul in a different direction. The plan was to go to Cyprus because that was home for Barnabas and John Mark. And then from Cyprus to take a ship from Paphos and to head to Rome. That was the plan. But instead, they head up to the mainland. And we'll talk about that next week. I'll take any questions if you have them. Bruce?
How did the Greeks and the Romans eat fast? You mentioned that there was cold, pepper, and how did they eat?
Yeah, good question. The question is, for those who are checking in online, how did they heat the baths? 2 different ways. Some of the baths were built around hot springs, so they'd use the hot spring waters. Most of the baths for most of these cities did not have hot springs. What they would do is they would have the water heated with a structure called a hypocaust, okay, a lower heating area, and then that water would be pushed through into the caldarium, because that's when the water is hottest, and then it would go to the tepidarium as it cools off a little bit more. They would actually have slaves that were hired there to tend to the fire, and the slaves were actually functioning in many capacities in these baths. So if we go to the apoditarium, that's where you take off your clothes. You don't want your clothes stolen, right? Because back in those days, of course, people don't have the kind of clothes that we have today. We have more clothes than we need, but so there would be a person, a slave in the apoditarium to make sure that the clothes went to the right person. And so you had people functioning in the baths in various ways. But it's a good question. That's another good question. Were the baths for men only? No. Of course, women need to bathe just as much as men need to bathe. And it's not known. It seems that there was probably times for men, times for women. Okay? Baths are very, very expensive, so it's not likely that they would have separate baths for women, separate baths for men. Although some cities, we probably won't have time to talk about Laodicea. Laodicea was a very, very wealthy city, and there's at least 4 baths in Laodicea. And it's not that big of a city. It's not one of the largest cities, but so it's possible that at Laodicea they could have had a men's bath, a women's bath. Probably different times of the day when men and women could occupy. But it was, again, naked, folks. It's not like a swimming pool, even though they did have swimming pools in the baths, okay? You don't go in with your trunks. They don't have trunks back in those days. Well, thank you for coming, and hope to see you next week. Close in.